Hello, good afternoon. Welcome back to my channel. Sorry I've not been around for a while, but as you may get from my voice, I've had COVID, which has been absolutely lovely. Slowed me down quite a bit, although I have managed to get on with a few projects. Not necessarily like writing, but I've done a lot of other fiddly bits and pieces of various other projects, which I will announce as soon as I can. So today I thought I'd read you another first chapter of a novel. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, well, didn't you just read us the first chapter of a new novel called Legion? Yes, I did. But that's a new novel. This one is one I've finished. And I'm actually currently going through a rewrite of this novel. But I've worked on the first few chapters to send off to agents. And they're pretty polished. And so I am going to start sending this off again. And as a way of getting some further feedback, I'm going to read you the first chapter. So here is the opening chapter of Stutter. Chapter 1, Clarke Harmon. After Clarke was murdered for the 7th time, the experience began to lose much of its novelty. The same electric jolts of pain, the same sickening wetness spreading across his stomach. He felt the now familiar rasp as the blade's serrated edge grazed a rib on its way out. Again he felt his heart thumping violently in his chest, but the shock factor was gone. As Clarke crumpled to his knees on the metal fire escape, he felt something almost like relief. Anticipating the blade was always far worse than the agony it brought, although that was pretty grim too. As Clarke died, he rested his head against the criss-cross metal, feeling its coolness as sticky blood oozed out between his fingers and through the tear in his hoodie. He heard the clatter as his killer, probably no older than 15, darted down the steps and belted across the patch of scrubby grass that separated the estate from the shopping precinct. The CCTV behind the phone shop had been inoperative for weeks. Clarke's murderer would never be identified or caught. As he lay gasping at his final moments, Clarke had the absurd thought that, this time, the kid who'd stabbed him had been wearing deck shoes rather than trainers. That was a first. How many times do you have to get stabbed before... His body seemed to make a move his brain hadn't consciously intended. It always took a little time for Clarke's mind to catch up with his body after each jump. Where was he this time? Ah, yes, the chicken shop. Then, as it always did, the future memory faded, leaving Clarke in a fog of strange familiarity, like he'd been here before. There was a word for it, something French. Déjà vu. With an odd relief, Clarke's bewildered mind latched onto something whose familiarity was unambiguous, his bike. Maybe he'd take a chance. He shuffled quietly across the semicircular parking area in front of the shops, beelining for the bike that rested against the window of the chicken shop. His bike, a Mafia with Marvel Extended Universe collectible cards inserted between the spokes. A swell of young girls was chatting loudly in front of the doorway, irritating the adults trying to get in and out, but also providing a moment of cover. An instant of opportunity, Clarke grabbed it. He walked calmly across the road and lay one hand in the centre of the handlebars, wheeling the bike away from the shop window, feeling a tug of something getting tangled in the spikes on the window ledge, but yanking the frame away and trying to look nonchalant. One girl with elaborately braided hair flashed him a look of warning. Shit. Trey's sister, Maz. As Clarke straddled the Mafia and loped away along the pavement, he heard a yell from the shop doorway and saw a gang of boys burst out, some with boxes of fried food in hand. 3 of them ran for their own bikes, and their leader, Trey, almost 6 foot tall and permanently gym fit, shouted, "You better run, bruv!" Clarke could do better than that. He had his bike back, and no one was more adept at navigating the neighbourhood than him. Under his skinny but agile frame, the bike metronomed from side to side as he built up speed. He could hear the distant whoops of the gang gaining on him, but that was just because he hadn't hit cruising speed yet. Nearly 3 weeks ago, Clarke had been cornered on the underpass between the Peeps and Johnson blocks. Trey and his crew had spotted his new bike and decided to take it from him. Angry and indignant at first, Clarke had seen the flash of steel in Trey's hand and pushed the Mafia in the older boy's direction, giving it enough pace to watch it crash into one of the gang leader's minions. The younger boy fronted aggression, but Trey held him back, knowing the value of being seen as a benevolent dictator. "Fair dues, blood. How did you know it was my birthday?" The gang sniggered appreciatively. Trey was a master at throwing shade. Then Trey entertained his crew with what Clarke had to grudgingly admit was a decent enough rear peg wheelie, looping his mafia around in a tight circle in front of the other boys while Clarke slinked away. It would only be the latest in a series of trials he'd had to bear. 3 days before, Clarke had caught his stepfather Lincoln chatting up his 13-year-old sister Yvonne. Although Lincoln had shrugged it off, there'd been an odd edge to his teasing voice as he told the girl how pretty she looked. Clarke would have to keep a particular eye on him. Clarke was also dealing with a promise he'd made to the pastor at his mum's church. He'd sworn he'd pass all 6 GCSEs this year, and man, Mrs. Braddock in maths was making that hard. She seemed to have taken a dislike to Clarke, who admittedly had goofed around all last spring, hating every minute of her abstract and bewildering class. Who had time for trigonometry when you're trying to stop your stepdad fucking your sister? Compared to what else he'd had on his plate, dodging and weaving through the estate with 6-armed rude boys on his tail was child's play. Clarke skidded around a corner to avoid an old bloke pushing takeaway menus through letterboxes on the ground floor flats and shuttled up an alley between towers leading to the playing fields beyond. Playing fields was a rather grandiose name for a blasted heath where folk dumped old mattresses and burnt out cars among the long grasses and nettles, but it was the only green space they had. Clarke followed a well-worn dirt track across a diamond of grass, hearing cries from behind him, which told him he had not lost the gang yet. On the last go-around, he'd been fast enough to give them the slip among the housing blocks. This time he'd have to find Plan B. It had rained heavily over the last 2 weeks, and a miniature lake had formed at the edge of the field, where it was boxed in by a brick wall in the corrugated side of a factory. Someone had ingeniously dropped a few lumps of concrete and 1 or 2 breeze blocks into the pond, creating a set of stepping stones. The gaps between them varied from an inch or two to a couple of feet, but Clarke had had plenty of time to practice this manoeuvre. Hours of poring over Danny McCaskill videos and collecting sprains and grazes had given him the confidence he needed to bunny hop between the rocks while his pursuers jeered futilely from the other side of the water. None of them wanted to get their box-fresh trainers wet. Grabbing a look behind him when he was halfway across, one junior foot soldier, a kid probably no older than 14, tried to hop along after him and misjudged the third hop, slipping off the stone and toppling over backwards into the murky water. A volley of laughter followed. Clarke got to the last stone, which was positioned beside a small gap where the end of the wall didn't quite meet the warehouse. If you were as skinny as Clarke, you could squeeze through. Clarke jumped off his bike and heaved it onto the top of the wall, pulling himself through the narrow gap. In so doing, his arm dislodged his glasses and they fell into the water below him. He had no time to retrieve them, though. Trey was leaping between the stepping stones on foot, and several of the gang had been sent wide to exit the fields by the footpath to Casper Street. Clarke guessed they planned to cut him off. He'd have to be quick. Putting his bike down off the wall and blinking against the blurry darkness of a cluttered yard, Clarke wheeled between stacks of tyres and boxes of car parts, making for the open rear door of the warehouse. Except this time it wasn't open. Although Clarke didn't know it, the door had been opened the last 6 times fate had led him here. Today something had changed. As Clarke turned to look for another exit, Trey jumped down from the wall and the other gang members screeched to a stop at the far end of the yard, the only entrance and exit. This go-around had no precedent, leaving no breadcrumb trail for Clarke's subconscious to follow, and he felt momentarily baffled and afraid of what might come next. Known horrors were never as frightening as unknown ones, and Clarke dropped all pretense in front and began to beat violently against the metal door. "Hey, open up!" Trey gave the ugly snort he used in place of a laugh. "What's up, bruv? Nowhere left to run." Clarke turned, and there was Trey dropping down from the wall. Clarke should have guessed he'd be athletic enough to get up there. 3 of Trey's boys appeared breathless on foot round the corner of Casper Street, including Skills, the skinny kid who'd stabbed him on 4 of the previous go-rounds. That one had something wrong with him. Impulse control, ADHD or whatever. Without his glasses, Clarke's vision wasn't clear enough to see if he was carrying a blade. They had him for both sides. "Fuck off!" Clarke shouted, unable to stop fear clouding his anger. The kids jeered and Trey mimed being stabbed in the heart. "You're bait, blood, and you got my wheels." Clarke couldn't help but laugh at the audacity of the gang leader. He was relentless, you had to give him that. Trey took a couple of steps forward, chin jutting in his aggressive manner. It was almost laughable, but Clarke didn't feel like laughing. Trey said, "Dash it over then, unless you want Skills to rework your smile." Presumably Skills was carrying, then. Shit, this could end one of 2 ways, neither of them good. Clarke felt a blazing sense of the unfairness of it all. He couldn't help but feel he was forever being victimised just for having the audacity not to give a fuck about postcodes and county lines, about dealing weed or stealing bikes. Bullied for the crime of wanting to escape all that. Forget the injustice of it all, though. Clarke needed an escape plan, and fast. He could try and ride through them, the riskiest of all strategies, especially as they had him cornered and he wouldn't be able to get up much speed. Just as Clarke was mulling over this option, there was a sudden metallic clang and a grinding sound behind him, and the corrugated metal door of the warehouse began to slide open, pushed by a scruffy figure with a startlingly tall grey-white afro. Lloyd, the foreman, first-generation Jamaican, and rumoured to have spent some time in a Kingston prison for killing a man in a bar fight. Just the man Clarke wanted to see. "What's going on here?" Lloyd inquired, yawning as if he'd just woken up. For a split second it looked like Trey was going to front Lloyd too, unwise since, although approaching 70, the foreman was still well connected, and he could clearly handle himself. Lloyd kept himself in shape. With a job that involved heaving car parts around all day, he pretty much had to. Trey sucked his teeth instead and pointed a warning finger at Clarke. "Catch you later, blood." There was some laughter at the double meaning in the kiss-off. Trey's rude boys thought he was funny. The neighbourhood wasn't exactly a hotbed of comedy talent. Clarke's antagonist sloped away while he caught his breath, and Lloyd stood looking at him with a quizzical expression. "You Felicia Harmon's kid?" Clarke nodded. "Breathe easy, son. Come inside and tell Lloyd what's up." Clarke calmed himself down enough to remember something. "You got a coat hanger or something?" Lloyd frowned, then nodded. "In me locker. What do you want that for?" Clarke tried to think of a way of making it sound normal. There was no way. "I need to go fish for my glasses." So there you go. Read with some difficulty by a man recovering from COVID. That is the first chapter of Stutter, and hopefully gives a flavour of the strangeness to come. Anyway, let me know if you enjoyed that, and I might even read you some more, if so. Not all of it, obviously, because I want you to buy the book if it comes out, but I might read you another chapter or two. So, until next time, when I feel well enough to write a random word story, farewell.